We are pleased to be hosting a debate which features a wide range of opinions on a timely and certainly contentious topic of military action against Iran's nuclear program.
Thank you all so much for coming. And this is a very timely debate, not just because the Prime Minister of Israel has just concluded an important trip to the United States, where we saw in his speech to AIPAC what I thought was about as clear as a Prime Minister can make about what, at least his view that he is at the very least reserving the option to attack Iran's nuclear facilities. But it is also tonight the holiday of Purim, which is the Jewish holiday commemorating yet another example of how in Iran there was a threat to the Jewish community there, and the Jews managed to survive and oust the tormentor Haman, and ultimately he ended up being hung in the gallows that he had fitted for Jews. And this significance was not lost on Prime Minister Netanyahu, who gave a Book of Esther to President Obama in his state visit. So we are really fortunate today, because right here we have three of the top experts in Washington to debate what I think is the probably top foreign policy issue that is facing the United States and the world right now. So to my left is Elbridge Colby, who is currently a research analyst at the Center for Naval Analysis, and has held a number of important positions, and has recently written an important, I guess you could say, rebuttal to Matthew Kroenig, man here to my right, piece in Foreign Affairs, arguing about, and I would say it's sometimes Matt's piece in Foreign Affairs is described as a case for attacking Iran. I think what Matt's piece is more is laying out the conditions under which the United States should attack Iran. Is that correct? Anyway. Anyway, Matt is an assistant professor at Georgetown University, where he teaches government. He's an expert in non-proliferation issues, and he has just come off of working at the Pentagon on this very question. And finally, there's Jamie Fly, who I'm sure all of you know as the executive director of the Foreign Policy Initiative, who is hosting this great event, and also a veteran of the George W. Bush administration, where he served on the National Security Council and also worked in the Office of the Secretary of Defense. He's an expert in counterproliferation issues and knows quite a bit about Iran and Syria and missile defense and all kinds of things. So we're very lucky to have all three with us. And with that, although I might have been a little short, I would like to get opening statements. And let's start with the case 4 from Mr. Kroenig.
Well, thank you very much for that introduction, Eli. It's really a pleasure to be here. I'd like to begin by thanking the Foreign Policy Initiative for organizing this important event, and Jamie Fly for pulling it together. I'd also like to thank my co-panelists, Eli Lake and Bridge Colby. And finally, last but not least, I'd like to thank my fiancée, Daniela Helfet, for coming tonight. But turning to the subject at hand, I agree with Eli that Iran's rapidly advancing nuclear program poses the greatest emerging national security challenge to the United States. So deciding how to deal with this problem, I think, is the most important issue facing the United States government right now. And as I see it, there are only 3 ways that this issue is going to play out. First, we could get some kind of diplomatic settlement with Iran. Second, we could simply acquiesce to a nuclear-armed Iran. Or third, we could conduct a military strike to prevent Iran from acquiring nuclear weapons. Now, clearly, if Iran were willing to give up its uranium enrichment program tomorrow, that would be the ideal solution. I think we would all celebrate that, and our jobs here would be done. But I think we all also recognize that at this point, getting a diplomatic settlement is highly unlikely. In fact, it's really hard to imagine any overlap between what Iran's supreme leader would be willing to agree to in terms of curbs on his uranium enrichment program that would simultaneously reassure the United States and reassure the West that Iran's nuclear program is no longer a problem. So if that's correct, and diplomacy and sanctions can't solve this problem, that means that sometime very soon the United States is going to face this very difficult decision between putting in place a deterrence and containment regime to deal with a nuclear-armed Iran, or conducting a strike. Now, a nuclear-armed Iran poses, turning to option 2, a nuclear-armed Iran would pose a grave threat to international peace and security. It would lead to further proliferation in the region and around the world. Iran would be more aggressive in terms of its course of diplomacy, in terms of its support to terrorist and proxy groups. So this means that the Middle East could become an even more crisis-prone region. And with a nuclear-armed Iran and nuclear-armed Israel, potentially other nuclear-armed states in the region, any one of these crises would have the potential to result in a nuclear exchange, which, given Israel's small size, could very well result in the destruction of the State of Israel. And once Iran has delivery vehicles capable of reaching the United States, which experts estimate could be within 5 years, any one of these crises could result in a nuclear exchange, a nuclear attack on the east coast of the United States. So this is a severe threat that we'd have to live with as long as Iran exists as a state and has nuclear weapons, which could be decades or longer. So as both President Obama and President Bush have said, a nuclear-armed Iran is unacceptable. So this leaves us then with the military option. And the military option is not an attractive option. There are significant risks. But that said, the military option can accomplish some things. It's almost certain that the United States could destroy Iran's key nuclear facilities. The United States could set back then Iran's nuclear ambitions by, it's difficult to estimate with any precision, but I estimate somewhere between 3 and 10 years. And so this creates a lot of space for something to happen where Iran ends up permanently without nuclear weapons. Now, as I said, there are risks to a strike, the foremost of which I think is Iranian retaliation. But I think Iranian military retaliation is not nearly as grave as many people think it would be. And the United States could put in place a strategy to mitigate some of these worst-case scenarios in the event of military action. So in sum, I argue that if the United States finds itself in this difficult position, it should conduct a surgical strike on Iran's key nuclear facilities, pull back and absorb an inevitable round of Iranian retaliation, and then seek to quickly de-escalate the crisis. So, thank you.
All right. Rich?
Thanks, Eli and Matt and Jamie and FPI for a great event. Thanks for all for coming. I'll lay out the argument for why we should not attack Iran in a preventive fashion, as Matt has advocated. And just to start off, the issue for me is getting to the best outcome, which is minimizing the consequences if we assume that the Iranians are pursuing a nuclear weapons program, which seems to be a reasonable assumption. There are 3 basic reasons why not. One is it doesn't work. The second is the costs are high. And the third, and probably the most important, is that the alternative does work. Let me address the first one first. It doesn't work. An attack could, no doubt, along the lines that Matt advocates, particularly if executed by the United States, could substantially damage the Iranian nuclear program. There's no question about that. But it really, in principle, would only, in practice, would only delay the program. The usual figure you see is maybe 1 to 2 years. And that's highly variable. There's no way of knowing. I heard a very, very senior former military officer who had responsibility for this kind of thing say that even he wasn't sure that we would be able to get all the targets, that we knew of all the targets, and so forth. And the Iranians aren't dumb. They've been hardening their facilities. They've been making them redundant. They have air defenses and so forth. Again, we could do damage, but it would delay. The reason why that's not sufficient is that an attack like that would absolutely validate the Iranian regime's perception that they need a nuclear weapon, which would cause them to redouble and probably intensify their nuclear weapons program. And in so doing, they would make it even more defensible. They would harden their facilities more. They might make them more redundant or more mobile or more opaque, et cetera. And it would also foreclose the option of having them stop at some kind of at least tolerable point short of a nuclear weaponized program. So basically what you'd get is you'd get a situation in which they clearly saw that they would need to go get it, and they would do so in a much more effective and efficient fashion, likely. The other problem in the doesn't work category is that it's almost certain to rally the Iranian people around the regime. There's nothing like bombing another country, particularly if you're the Americans, to cause the people to rally around the regime. And this is what we don't want to have. There is a substantial dissenting movement in Iran that we should give every opportunity to eventually overthrow or transform the regime, because that is the solution. The solution is some kind of change in the perceptions of the regime. Bombing them isn't going to work. We bombed the North Koreans for 7 years, the North Vietnamese for 7 years to try to do this. We bombed the North Koreans. We even dropped atomic bombs on the Japanese, and they barely gave up. So bombing, especially a limited strike, it's going to catalyze support for the regime, and it's going to set us back politically. So the question is, do we really want to put ourselves in a situation where we're in a kind of perpetual strike motion, where we're on a kind of treadmill? And I think the answer to that is no. I think that doesn't answer the problem, and it actually worsens it. And here's some reasons why. The second point is the costs of such action are high. First off, people usually talk about direct Iranian retaliation. Matt's right that it's not the end of the world. It's not a Soviet retaliatory nuclear strike, but it's not insignificant, especially when you consider that the benefits are quite limited. There's obviously the terrorism aspect, terror on the airlines, against embassies and cultural centers, American, Israeli, European, around the world. There's Hezbollah and direct Iranian attacks against Israel itself, as well as U.S. forces in the region. There's the oil issue and the closing off, or at least disrupting the Straits of Hormuz, with the potential for setting off a global recession. That's a lot of the markets are very skittish about that. There's other things they could do. They could give man-pads and other air defense systems to Taliban in Afghanistan. They could destabilize Iraq and the Gulf, etc. So there's a lot of things they can do that would, I think, satisfy the criterion that Matt set, which is a limited form of retaliation, but would really make our lives very difficult and might have a direct impact on American and Israeli civilians. The second cost would be the diminution of international support. Almost certainly an attack like this would cause the fracture, or at least the significant deterioration, of any international coalition that you need to have, not only to do a containment-style regime, but to keep up the sanctions that are necessary for these perpetual motion attacks to work. For instance, the Russians, we don't love the Russians, but they have agreed not to sell the Iranians the S-300 air defense system. General Mattis pointed out today the difficulties of intervening in Syria because of a relatively advanced air defense system. That's the kind of thing that makes a big difference, and it gives us the ability to do something later if we want, even if it's not an attack on the Iranian nuclear program. Clearly, it would alienate the Arab and the Muslim world, and probably the world more broadly. I'm not a huge believer in soft power, but if it ain't broke, don't fix it. Don't cause problems that you don't need to cause. That is clearly a cost. And finally, especially if you didn't really solve the problem, if you just stuck them in the face and you didn't actually stop them from getting a nuclear weapon later, you could incentivize other countries to get nuclear weapons, like the North Koreans have seen, because you never want to fight the Americans. You never want to be at the mercy of the Americans without nuclear weapons. The third point is the alternative works. Containment and deterrence is tough. It's not a great option. Obviously, I admit that. But it's doable. This is not the Soviet Union. This is not 45,000 nuclear warheads that the United States is facing and conventional superiority in the European theater. There's two things that are involved basically to make containment or deterrence work: capability and will. The U.S. has total escalation dominance over the Iranians at every higher level of warfare, and it has a very tailored capability. If the Iranians do anything, we can get back at them in a way that hurts them and that is tailored to the provocation in a way that puts them in a very bad place. And ultimately, we can use our strategic nuclear forces if we want. And we're not the only ones. We have allies in the region. There's Israel, there's the Gulf states, there's NATO, etc. Also, we have missile defenses, which even if the Iranians get long-range missiles, if these missile defenses actually are supposed to work as they're advertised, they should be able to intercept Iranian missiles, and I think they should be able to do that. In terms of will, people seem to question the U.S. will to stay in the region. The U.S. has been deeply involved in the Middle East, at least since the British pulled back from the area in the late 60s, and certainly since the late 70s in the Iranian Revolution. There's oil in the region, and we need it for the foreseeable future. No matter what people talk about green jobs, we need oil. Done. Israel, it's a major interest of the United States. There's a strong bonds of affection. We're going to be in the region. There's strong resolve. This might not work, or it might not really be palatable if the Iranians were truly lunatics. But the Iranian, people argue about whether they're rational or not, and it depends on your definition of rational. I think they're minimally rational in the way that they need to be. Another way to think about it is the Iranians are strategic. And if you look at the way the Israelis treat, or the American forces in the region, for instance, in Iraq have treated the Iranians, we all know they're strategic. They respond to various cost-benefit incentives. They're odious, they're malevolent, they're risk-tolerant, they are willing to accept costs, but they're people who will be affected by the prospect of total destruction or tailored destruction. Finally, a couple just on the non-proliferation thing, Matt made this point. Would the Iranian acquisition lead to a cascade of proliferation? It's a danger, but not necessarily. Basically, the question for Saudi Arabia and Turkey is it better to stick with the United States security umbrella, which is the best military force in the world, the largest nuclear umbrella in the world, highly capable, highly resolute, or are they going to go and endow their National Guard with security of the Saudi state. They have not done that in decades, and it would be really dumb. And I don't think the Saudis are dumb. So there are ways to handle it if we show the capability and the resolve, and so that is critical. The key bottom line is to show to Tehran that they will not gain from nuclear weapons acquisition, but that they will suffer from the attempt to use it. Basically, to put a kind of a crude way of putting it, the idea is to put our feet on their neck so that they can't really gain from the acquisition. So I'll close with a comment by the great British strategist Michael Howard. The only thing worse than the prospect of an Iran armed with nuclear weapons would be the consequences of using force to try to stop them.
Okay. Jamie.
Thanks, Eli, and thanks everyone for coming. It's a great pleasure to be up here tonight with three very good friends, and I've enjoyed my conversations with all three of them about this issue in recent months. I'm in I guess, a difficult position going last here, and I'm also since we're having kind of a three-way debate here, I'm in a difficult position because I agree with elements of both of my two counterparts here. So I'm tempted to kind of go in all different directions in making my argument. But I will say the main reason that Gary Schmidt from the American Enterprise Institute and I wrote the piece on the Foreign Affairs website in response to Matt's article was I thought although I agreed with a lot of it, I thought there were some just fundamental flaws in the case he was making. I agree with Matt's analysis of the threat posed by Iran. I agree with his analysis that containment will not work, so I disagree with a lot of what Bridge just described, and I'm sure we'll get into all of that in a minute. I will say, by the way, as of Friday now, Bridge is to the left of President Obama on that question because he was, in his interview that came out with Jeff Goldberg of The Atlantic, I think President Obama, more forcefully than I've ever seen him say, said containment is not my policy, and specifically referred to the concerns about a cascade of nuclear proliferation, which would completely run counter to the nonproliferation agenda that the president laid out in his Prague speech early in 2009. So I do think that there is a general consensus that containment would be very difficult to make work, and even that is not a good option, as Bridge noted, and none of these are good options that we're talking about. But while I have concerns about Bridge's advocacy of containment, I have concerns about Matt's suggested approach, because I think that doesn't address the fundamental issue. So I guess if you were to take anything away from my take on this issue, in stealing a line from James Carville, I would say it's the regime stupid is the bottom line. This is not just about Iran's nuclear program. Our concerns with Iran are much greater and should be much greater. And so if it comes to the point where U.S. policymakers are needing to make and have this sort of debate that we're having in the White House Situation Room and make this decision, I think we need to think bigger than even Matt's suggestion of a limited strike. I won't go into the whole argument about the nature of the regime, but I think people often gloss over, and I think the mainstream media also glosses over some of the key facts that, Bridge in his article made a comment that this would be about attacking Iran without provocation. Iran has been provoking us for decades. Iran has been killing Americans for decades, both through its terrorist proxies, but also through its direct support for some of America's enemies in Iraq in recent years, with its support to Shiite militants, and also to the Taliban in Afghanistan. American soldiers have been dying because of Iranian government policy. Its longstanding support for terrorist groups is something we need to factor in, and we've heard a little bit about that in terms of how Iran would respond to an attack. But its activities in the region through its terrorist proxies, as well as its government actions, have contributed to long-term instability in the Middle East, even without nuclear weapons. And a lot of the argument we hear about the case against military action, including apparently from some in the administration, is that the concern about the global energy markets, higher gas prices. Well, imagine what it's going to be like when we're pursuing containment policy, and there are constant proxy battles happening in various places. This is not going to be a more stable system. We're going to have the same issues that we have now, and perhaps even worse. Bridge noted this a little bit. It is a repressive, horrible regime. I don't think we should forget that. Iran executes more people per capita than any country in the world. And obviously, it's just as we saw in June 2009 with the crackdown, when people rose up after the fraudulent re-election of President Ahmadinejad, the methods that they are willing to use are brutal. Now, we have problems, and a lot of other countries in the world have similar systems, and that doesn't mean that we take military action against all of them. So I think the nuclear issue and the concerns of our ally Israel and the broader instability that Iran possessing nuclear weapons would pose certainly are the driving factor here. But Matt advocates a limited strike, and my argument is that a limited strike is not going to even adequately address the nuclear program. Matt in his article talks about the cases of Iraq in 1981, the Osirak reactor that Israel struck, and Syria more recently in 1997, the Al-Kabar reactor. Those are, as Gary and I point out in our article, were very different nuclear programs, basically based on just a limited number of facilities. The Iranian nuclear program of 2012 is much more extensive, much more spread out. Unless you have a significant target list, you're not going to be able to take out the major elements of the program. You're going to leave a lot behind and allow them to reconstitute the program, probably in an underground, covert manner fairly quickly. Another aspect of my concern about Matt's argument is, and Bridge, I think, and I agree on this a bit, is Iran will respond even to a limited strike. And I think the notion that we can somehow conduct a surgical strike and preclude the Iranians from responding in any major way is just not the case. And so we are going to be, if we pursue this option, in a conflict with Iran. And the implications of that are going to be there whether it's a limited strike or the sort of strike that Gary and I propose. And that gets to the point that the U.S. military does not plan limited operations. We are not the Israelis. We have significant capabilities. This will not be a one-off. Even if the most limited strike is pursued and the target list is kept fairly narrow, air defense sites will be hit. Iranian ability to mine the Straits of Hormuz or cause other problems in the region will be on the target list. This will probably take several weeks, even if we pursue the limited strike. If that is the case, why not go a step further and expand the target list and go after regime assets that are involved in the repression of their people and are key to the regime's stability? Why not put command and control and leadership elements on that target list? And so now, this is not a magical solution. I would never argue that this is going to cause the problem or instantaneously bring down the regime. And I'm not arguing for a ground invasion of Iran. But I do think that there is a viable opposition movement that's been significantly repressed in recent years. But there is the potential that we could help create the space and weaken the regime to help foment, I think, regime change from within, which I think all of us in the end would agree, assuming we got the Democratic opposition in a position where they could step up and take over, would be the best outcome, because we would not have to pursue all these worst options. So on that, I just end, and we'll have the discussion, but I think containment is not an option, and I think the limited strike has serious downsides. And if we get to the point where, because we're concerned that the Israelis are going to take action, or because we feel that that the clock has run out and we need to take action, I think we need to remember that it's the regime that's the problem, just not just a limited number of nuclear facilities in Iran.
Well, thank you very much. And now I have the privilege of asking each debater a question, or maybe a set of questions. So I'm going to start with Matt here. And originally I had a thought which was based on the Colin Call response to your article, but as you were giving your presentation, I thought of another question, not to catch you off guard. But it's pretty clear, if you look at Israel's estimates and other estimates of the Iranian nuclear program, that they're always like 2 years away, and then they keep pushing it out in the future. And I once asked this question of very senior Israeli intelligence analysts, and I wanted to know if that was because the Israeli analysts were not good at their job, or because the Mossad saboteurs were very good at their job. And so I ask you, if it seems like there has been a pretty extensive intelligence war against Iran's nuclear program that has at times involved assassination of scientists, cyber warfare, and other more conventional means, such as what the CIA calls modified equipment, then why not continue that and risking a kind of full-scale conflagration and just keep delaying it through these sneakier and plausibly deniable methods?
Well, thanks for that question, Eli. It's an important one. So I think you're absolutely right that the United States and other countries have, pursued these other methods of slowing down the Iranian nuclear program. But these efforts have been going on for some time. And if you look at just simple objective indicators of Iran's nuclear progress in the IAEA reports issued every 3 months, amount of LEU being produced, number of centrifuges coming online, Iran continues to make steady progress every 3 months, despite these efforts. So it's possible that Iran's progress would have been steeper had it not been for these other efforts. But it's clear that these efforts haven't been enough to, set back Iran's nuclear program. And so they're not going to be enough to solve the problem. So I think we should continue them, but I think it would be unwise to think that this is somehow the solution. And so, it gets to a question of how close Iran is to having a nuclear capability too, which I think is a key point in this debate. And so when you're thinking about stopping Iran from having a nuclear weapons capability, it's all about how long until they have enough weapons-grade fissile material to make their first bomb. Once they have the material, the game's over. The military option really no longer works. And so right now, analysts estimate that if Iran made the decision today to pursue nuclear capability to enrich from the 20% where it's enriching today up to the 90% it would need for nuclear weapons, that it would take about 6 months. But that timeline is shrinking as Iran brings more and more centrifuges online. And so an estimate by Ali Heinonen, the former deputy director of the IAEA, is that by the end of the year, that timeline will have shrunk to about 1 month. So December of this year, Iran makes a decision to dash to a nuclear weapon. We'll have about 1 month to make that decision. So you might be right that we've been premature in our estimates in the past, but I think it's pretty clear that Iran is getting close, and it's really time to have this discussion of how we want to deal with the issue.
Well, thank you for that. All right, Bridge, now I have a question for you. In your presentation and in your in some of your articles about this, you have suggested that a strike on Iran's nuclear facilities would, further harden the positions of the Iranian leadership and make them more determined to pursue a nuclear weapon. But I guess my question is, really? You don't think that they're really determined right now? You don't think that they looked at what happened to Libya when Gaddafi gave up his nuclear program and saw that Gaddafi lost his regime with the help of a Western coalition? So I guess my question is, how much are we talking about in terms of the effect it would have on Iranian decision makers? From my modest vantage point here in Washington, it seems like they're pretty determined to get a nuclear weapon. They also seem that they really don't like the United States. They say it all the time.
Yeah, well, we don't like them either, so the feeling's mutual. But, it's true, but except they're clearly not going, as rapidly or as sort of wholeheartedly as they could. The intelligence community's assessment, which I have no reason to question, is that they have not begun the weaponization process yet. They're clearly at least toying with the IAEA. Personally, it looks like a pretty cynical ploy, but it also does involve some delay. There's some virtue in slow rolling them, and part of the problem with the attack is not so much that it would change their fundamental resolve, but it would change the benefits of their sort of strategy. The Iranians may say, we'd love to have a nuclear weapon, but there are actually significant costs to actually pursuing it right now that cause us to sort of dilly-dally or slow roll the program. If we attack them, they're saying there's no disincentive to immediate acquisition of a nuclear weapon, and moreover, they'd change as I think Jamie pointed out rightly, they would change the nature, the physical structure, the operational kind of context of the program in such a way that it would be much, much harder for us to interdict it in the future. And I think there's also, if we attack it, there are also follow-on consequences. For instance, if they do acquire and we have attacked them, then I think we've intensified the stability problems that Matt points out. If we don't attack them and we say we have this deterrent posture and say if you come after us in such and such a way, we will consider using these nuclear weapons or whatever else we deem appropriate, then there's a chance to have them be in a less kind of trigger-happy, unstable kind of format, which is in everybody's interest. But I think if we go after and we attack them, we put them not only in a position where they're resolute on the point, where they harden their facilities and so forth, but they're also going to be in a position where they're going to be looking that they might have to launch early in precisely the kind of way that we don't want.
Well, thank you for that. Now, Jamie, you have talked about the need to change the regime in Iran, but many experts who look at this, including many Iranian dissidents, now I want to just preface what I'm about to say in that a lot of times Iranian dissidents in Iran are limited in what they can say publicly. So keep with that in mind. But what I've heard for some time is that increased tensions with the United States, and that would obviously include a bombing campaign, would make their life a lot more difficult. And it would give a pretext to the regime to even further repress the elements that you would like to one day see take over the Iranian political system and hopefully reform it. So my question to you is, what if you're wrong and that bombing the regime targets and bombing these nuclear facilities only further entrenches the current regime in power? And are you prepared to support an invasion if that doesn't work?
Yeah, I think that part of our strategy, especially a lot of people who are following this post June 2009, the hope was that the nuclear timeline was such that we would see regime change from within happen by itself. And we could pursue our course on the sanctions and other efforts to pressure the regime, but that the Iranian people would take matters into their own hands. That has obviously not happened, and I think without getting into a nerdy debate about timelines, et cetera, which I have some I think
already in a
maybe
debate.
Matt and I know from some of the things Matt has written and said, I, for one, question the intelligence community's views on this, having and been in a dialogue with them when I was in the Bush administration on these very issues, and the analysts at the agency and others who follow this. I think their assessments are overly cautious and an overreaction to the intelligence debacle of Iraq. And that's partly because of some institutional problems within the U.S. intelligence community. And getting on a sidetrack here, I'll get back to the Queen question in a minute, but President Obama, in his response to the Israelis, is basically saying, we have time, and he said this in both his speech and in the press availability as well as the interview with Jeff Goldberg, we have time and we would have plenty of lead time and know if they make that final decision and make the push toward a weapon. He is basically putting Israel's future and our future security and our interest in the region in the hands of the Central Intelligence Agency and other key elements of the intelligence community. I'm not comfortable doing that. I think that's incredibly dangerous, given their track record. When it comes to nuclear weapons programs, I think, and others on the panel probably know more about this than I think you go back to China's development of nuclear weapons, India, Pakistan. You look at their various assessments about Iraq's WMD programs, and almost every time they were wrong. And we're literally talking, depending on what experts you talk to, like Matt cited, sometimes a matter of months. That's not a situation we should be in, that we'll take action when we see it happening. It's just very dangerous. So that's a side point. But clearly, the Iranian opposition has been repressed significantly since June 2009. And yes, some in the opposition, I think, would not like to see U.S. military action, maybe the majority. But I do think as the opposition has struggled to take hold, you've even seen members of the Iranian opposition moving their views, even on things like sanctions.
Right.
And many of them used to be opposed to any sanctions against Iran because they argue that it hurt the people. Most of them, I think, now support the sanctions regime because they're so fed up and frustrated with the state of the regime. And so I think that I think even on the issue of military action, if it was done correctly, and if in the broader campaign I'm outlining here, you could go after regime elements that are directly involved in repression, and I think anyone who's advocating for military action would make keeping civilian casualties to a minimum a priority. And so if you do structure the campaign that way, I do think there's a potential there. And I will admit I might be wrong, but I think then we get to the broader debate about whether containment or these other options are any worse, and I certainly think they are, than the uncertainty that even we're talking about in the aftermath of a military strike.
I mean, would you support, if you are wrong, at some point an invasion that would finish the job of regime change?
Not at this point. I don't think that there's an appetite in the international community for that, and certainly not in the U.S. given all the other commitments we have.
Okay, well, we get to the point now, I think, from questions from the audience. Is that right? And are we doing this where people write down stuff on an index card, as I was led to believe? Or, here we go. Very good. Just give me a second here, because I just got these. But, oh, this is a good one. Okay. And I wish we had names on this, because this is a smart question. And I'm just going to open this up to the panel, but who aids Iran if it's attacked, particularly in the aftermath of strikes? China, Pakistan, Russia?
Well, clearly we know Hezbollah and Hamas and the other sort of list of unsavory characters in the region, presumably the Taliban. I think there's a sort of I'll take the question sort of in a broader way. I mean, I think there's a small group of organizations that are actually going to aid Iran directly. The issue is more that there would probably be a shift in the international community, including China and Russia, in ways that would make further action against the Iranians in a meaningful sense very difficult, not just from a kind of UN Security Council, fuzzy diplomacy sort of way, but the actual implementation of sanctions, for instance. I mean, we need the Chinese and the Russians to sign on to withhold future arms sales. I mean, when we fought the North Vietnamese and the North Koreans, they basically had guaranteed supplies from their communist patrons, and we basically couldn't stop it because we didn't want to risk escalation. So we have to be very, very, very conscious of that. And if the Iranians took action against us, and let me clarify one thing. Jamie made an important point. I just want to clarify. Absolutely, the Iranians have been provoking us and attacking us for a long time. What I meant particularly was that if they haven't provoked an attack on the scale of what Matt and certainly Jamie are talking about, I think our posture should be that we should orient our reaction to Iranian attacks or aggression or attempted coercion in such a way that it basically convinces them, or in the future deters them from that action. And that might be a very disproportionate response. In fact, it probably should be. But I don't want to give the impression that I don't think the Iranians are behaving badly already.
Do you have any thoughts on who aids Iran if they're attacked?
Well, I'm not sure exactly what the questioner means by aid, what type of aid. I mean, I think that it's incredibly, I think that if the United States did this, as Jamie rightly pointed out, we'd do this very differently than Israel would do it in a number of different ways. One is that we'd go in with a bigger force package, I think, as Jamie rightly points out. The second is that we would try to build international coalition to go in with us. And so, we might even try to table a UN Security Council resolution. China and Russia almost certainly would veto such a resolution. They would almost certainly protest a U.S. attack, a U.S.-led attack on Iran. But if by aid Iran it's meant would China and Russia take some kind of direct action and retaliation against the United States, I think the answer to that's almost certainly no. I don't think that they would retaliate in any way against the United States. The question could be what happens after a strike. Are they more sympathetic to Iran after a strike than they are now? Does it weaken the coalition, as Bridge pointed out? And I think that's a possibility. I think it could be harder to maintain this international coalition against Iran after a strike than it is beforehand. But I think that we need to keep our priorities straight here. The point of building the coalition is to prevent Iran from acquiring nuclear weapons. So if we reach a point where we have to choose between allowing Iran to have nuclear weapons or striking and potentially undermining the coalition, I think it's pretty clear that the strike is the better option, and that if that means undermining the coalition, then so be it. The coalition isn't good in and of itself. It's there to serve a purpose to prevent Iran from acquiring nuclear weapons.
Jamie, do you have any thoughts on this?
Just briefly, I basically agree with my colleagues. I don't think that a lot of countries would be rushing to Iran's aid. Actually, I think a lot of our allies in the Gulf, they don't like to say this publicly, but they'd be quite happy if the U.S. or even, quite frankly, if Israel took action by itself. And Russia and China would rail about it, but in the end, it wouldn't really matter, I don't think. I will, a somewhat related point, I would even throw out there, if we, because we're obsessed with intelligence timelines and we think we have time, or if we decide to adopt a containment strategy, I actually would wonder what the repercussions are about that. What would that do to our allies in the region, not just Israel? How would our Gulf allies treat us in the future? How would they view American statements about anything, quite frankly? Because we've had successive U.S. administrations from both political parties who have said a nuclear Iran is unacceptable. Well, then what if Iran gets nuclear weapons? What does that say about U.S. leadership in the world? What does that tell our allies in Asia who are looking fearfully at the rise of China and looking to the U.S. for reassurance? I would argue that it really would completely undermine our foreign policy around the world. And so I think there are broader implications on the other side of that coin as well.
Bridge has a response to that.
That's a great question. I mean, one thing that we should do is modulate our rhetoric so that we don't give people the impression that our extended deterrence arrangements will be completely undermined by acquisition by small states like North Korea Korea and Iran have a nuclear weapon. So I agree with Jamie that we have a problem to deal with. Using terms like unacceptable and then not following through is a problem. I also agree with his point about China, except we have a huge problem in the Pacific. China is a massive growing power with expanding interests, a very rapidly growing military capability. We cannot afford to be getting in wars that we don't need to get into because we need to concentrate on strengthening our military posture in the Pacific.
This next question comes from Jamie Weinstein of the Daily Caller, a young writer you all should check out on the internet. And he asks, and I think this is best addressed to Matt and Jamie, though I'd love to hear he says, why not a hybrid approach between Matthew and Jamie? Target the Iranian nuclear program and then threaten to expand your bombing targets to regime targets if they retaliate.
I'll take one, please. Well, thank you very much for that question. I think that's an excellent point, and that's exactly the point I make in my article, which is, I think the problem with Jamie's approach is, it violates the first rule of diplomacy, which is, don't back your opponent into a corner, give your opponent a way to back down. And so I think Iran does have some retaliatory options, such as chemical and biological weapons attacks, closing the Strait of Hormuz, terrorist attacks in the United States that are fairly serious. But I think that those are options that Iran would only exercise if it really felt like the regime was at risk, if it felt like it was a final showdown and it had nothing left to lose. And so I don't think we want to put Iran in that position. On the other hand, if we do what I advocate in the piece, which is make it very clear to Iran, both through our messaging and through our targeting, that we're only interested in the nuclear facilities, that we're going to destroy the nuclear facilities, and then we're going to back off. And that's sufficient for us. We're willing to stop there. But make it very clear that if they retaliate in a major way and cross some of these red lines, if they use, say, chem or bio, if they conduct terrorist attacks in the United States, if they close the Strait of Hormuz, that will come back then with a more devastating military response. And I think by doing that, we can deter Iran. Put yourself in the shoes of the supreme leader. You wake up one morning and your nuclear facilities are gone, but your regime is intact, your military is intact. What do? You really have your own strategic dilemma. If you don't strike back hard enough, you lose face. But if you strike back too hard, you lose your head. And, I think we all know how people would behave in those situations. I think that we could then induce Iran to engage in some form of limited retaliation. And in my view, I think that would be a good trade, to trade Iran's nuclear program for token retaliation. Then we leave it up to Iran. If Iran wants to continue to go, then we can make it a bigger fight. So I think it's possible that we could end up where Jamie recommends, but I don't think that we should start there.
Jamie.
Yeah, this is actually another concern I had about Matt's argument, because, if it was possible that we were 100% certain that we could take out the nuclear facilities and actually propose this bargain to the regime, then it might have some merit. I guess in the fog of war, as the planes are flying, I don't have that much faith in the back channel, whatever back channel we have with the Iranians, that we can assume that the message would be conveyed appropriately and that they would react the way Matt says they would. I have a broader problem too, given that a lot of my argument is that this is about the nature of the regime. So even if you can take out the nuclear sites, and it's actually even worse if you then go to the regime and basically say, hey, this is the price of you staying in power, you're basically admitting the regime is somehow legitimate. So what would the impact that then be in the following years about, does that mean that we're not going to do more to support the opposition? Does that mean that we're not going to respond if Iran continues to aid militants that are attacking our troops? And again, this is a broader issue, I think. And if you go, we didn't even mention the assassination plot that was announced a number of months ago here, but these are all things that if you look back, even in recent decades, President Clinton and others, President Reagan, they responded to these sorts of plots and attempted attacks with military force, with either cruise missile strikes and some sort of reaction. We have not responded either to the killing of American troops in Iraq or Afghanistan, or even to this most recently disrupted plot in any real substantive way with anything other than just talk and threat of additional sanctions in the case of the assassination plot, which never materialized. And so I wouldn't want to get dragged into this sort of discussion with the regime, because even if we could eliminate the nuclear program, even if Iran agreed to give up most of its ability to control the fuel cycle, we still have a broader problem with the regime, and our problem with Iran is not going to go away until these other activities are stopped as well.
If I may, just as a point of clarity, I think there are about 5 IRGC alleged diplomats in Erbil who may disagree with your assessment that there was no response to Iranian provocations in Iraq.
Meaningful way.
In a meaningful way, okay.
Yeah, I mean, my major reaction is, if Iran is so rational and cost sensitive, then why is it that they are going to behave in such a patently lunatic way if they get nuclear weapons, right? I mean, if Iran is so sensitive and so able to be communicated with, and to understand strategic signaling, and to understand very fine gradations in strategic bargaining and conflict, I don't see why that wouldn't hold if they get nuclear weapons. If they get nuclear weapons, there's no way that the Iranians can use nuclear weapons in a way that essentially does not result in massively disproportionate destruction for the Iranians. I mean, and the second point is, I kind of agree with Jamie on this. I'm sort of a big admirer of the sort of Eisenhower school, which is that, there's the fog of war, the war gets out of control, and also that it's a dangerous road to go down the idea that you can really kind of husband and finely tune escalation in the way that you did in Rolling Thunder in Vietnam, and that led to much sorrow. I mean, I think we should be very, very frightening to the Iranians, and that if they cross certain lines in certain ways, that they would suffer very significantly, and that's the kind of strategic calculus that they can understand.
Matt, you want to respond?
I just wanted to respond quickly to something that Bridge said, because it's also a point that some of my critics in the blogosphere have raised about my article. This point that, if I expect Iran to be cautious after a U.S. strike, and to fear for the future of the regime, and to behave in a way not to provoke a major U.S. response, then why do I think a nuclear-armed Iran would be so dangerous? Am I somehow assuming that they're rational after we attack them, but irrational after they have nuclear weapons? And so it's kind of cute to point out maybe there's a contradiction, but there's actually no contradiction at all, and the answer is quite simple. In one situation, they have nuclear weapons, in the other situation, they don't. So right now, Iran restrains its foreign policy because it fears major U.S. military retaliation. The primary goal of the regime is to continue to exist. It knows that the United States can threaten that goal. In the event of a limited U.S. strike on Iran's key nuclear facilities, its primary goal is still going to be to exist. It knows that a major response from the United States could threaten that. If Iran has nuclear weapons, however, we think it would be emboldened. Iran would have a nuclear counter-deterrent. It could try to deter a major U.S. military response with the threat of nuclear war. And so, again, Iran would be emboldened with nuclear weapons. It would no longer have to fear a major U.S. military retaliation. It would have a cover under which to behave more aggressively in terms of coercive diplomacy, in terms of support to terrorist and proxy groups, and just have a more aggressive foreign policy in general.
One more response.
Brief response. I think I anticipated Matt's point, which is that they still can't use nuclear weapons in a way that is even minimally rational without courting massive, very, very significant retaliation from the Americans and the Israelis. So even if they do have nuclear weapons, it's not rational for them to use them. And I find it particularly ironic from Matt, who has written extensively about how arsenal size is such a huge determinant in the resolution of crises. I mean, the Iranians are going to have a tiny, immature arsenal, and the Americans are going to have an incredibly sophisticated one. So it would be irrational of the Iranians to use the nuclear weapons in a way that would allow them to be emboldened. The only way that it would work for the Iranians is if we back down, or the Israelis back down. And that's why I think the comments by, I think the IDF chair, current one, not some of the previous ones, have been saying, the Hezbollah will be emboldened and we won't be able to handle them. That's bad. That's why Ephraim Halevi and these guys are saying, don't say it's an existential threat. We can handle this. We don't want it. We'll be able to deal with it, though.
All right, maybe one more. You want to do one more on this, because this is the debate right here.
Well, Bridge says it would be irrational for Iran to do something that could risk its existence, even if it had nuclear weapons, and I completely agree with that. I think that Iran wouldn't intentionally launch a suicidal nuclear war. That said, there's a lot that can go wrong with a nuclear-armed Iran, even if Iran isn't suicidal. So all the stuff that I talked about before, further proliferation in the region, Iran being more aggressive in terms of support to terrorists and proxies. I think all of that still holds. But even the big one here, nuclear war, I think is a possibility even if Iran is rational. I mean, after all, the United States isn't an irrational regime. We're not a suicidal regime. But we were willing to risk nuclear war and high-stakes crises time and time again during the Cold War. We came very close in the Cuban Missile Crisis to a nuclear war with the Soviet Union. And so I think there's every reason to believe that a nuclear-armed Iran would also find itself in high-stakes crises with a nuclear-armed Israel, with a nuclear-armed United States. And so Bridge might say, well, wouldn't they have an incentive to make sure that nuclear weapons weren't used? On one hand, yes. On the other hand, they have every incentive to make sure that their adversary thinks that there is a possibility that nuclear weapons could be used. So in that crisis situation, as countries are putting their nuclear weapons on high alert, trying to raise the risk of nuclear war intentionally to coerce their adversaries, there's a real risk that things could spiral out of control. And even a rational nuclear-armed Iran could result in a nuclear war with Israel or nuclear war with the United States.
Eli, can I jump in on this really quick?
Yeah.
Just to pick up, I actually think the debate about rationality is or irrationality is a bit of a moot point. I tend to think that we can't assume that Iran would be a rational actor with nuclear weapons. Also, just because, again, whether you think there's going to be a regime change tomorrow or whether it's going to be 10 years from now, it inherently, even with nuclear weapons, will be an unstable regime. Look at all the discussions we have about Pakistan and our concerns about the stability of the Pakistani government. There would always be the fear that you would have more extreme elements take over and get control of the nuclear weapons. But setting that whole discussion aside, the cascade of proliferation, I think, is what we really need to be concerned about when you talk about whether nuclear weapons would ever be used. Both of these gentlemen are much better nuclear theorists and know the history better than I do. But I think it would be a new situation for the world to deal with a series of nuclear powers in such a small, constrained, contained place in the Middle East, in a region that has been unstable for decades. How would we manage that? Extending a nuclear umbrella over Saudi Arabia, I just can't imagine that any administration, any Congress is ever going to go to the American people and say that we should treat an attack on Riyadh the same as an attack on Kansas City or Chicago. It's just not going to happen. I'd love to see that debate play out on the House floor. And so I think there is no way to convince these other countries from not going nuclear. And if you have 3, 4, 5 nuclear powers with a variety of rivalries, just look at the proxy wars that are going on right now in Syria between Saudi Arabia and Iran, or in Bahrain. Imagine if those countries had nuclear weapons. The potential for escalation, even if it's accidental, is just through the roof. And so I think that's what we have to be concerned about in terms of the use of nuclear weapons, not necessarily whether in this kind of binary Israel versus Iran, whether one of them would use nuclear weapons.
So you think the Middle East is prone to misunderstandings at times?
Yes, you could say that.
All right. This is a question, I think, for the entire panel, but it's a good one. What specific interests of the people of the United States, besides Israel, it's a little bit of a non sequitur there because Israelis are not Americans, but are under specific material threat by Iran? Be specific. I don't know who wrote this, but it's a good question.
Well, I think there are a lot, but I'll just start with one to let my co-panelists respond. As I pointed out in my opening remarks, Iran is working on ballistic missiles with wide ranges to deliver nuclear warheads once it acquires them. Secretary Gates said while he was Secretary of Defense that Iran, if it got outside assistance, could have ballistic missiles capable of reaching the east coast of the United States within 5 years. And the United States and Iran have found itself in conflicts before. I mean, we'll all remember just a few weeks ago, we were making threats and counter-threats over the Strait of Hormuz. So it's possible that the United States and Iran will find itself in a crisis in the future. It's possible, if both countries are nuclear armed, that this would become a nuclear crisis. And it's possible that in a crisis like that, things could spin out of control and result in a nuclear exchange. So I think the stakes to the United States are pretty high. The direct material threat to the United States is pretty real. We're talking about potential nuclear war against the U.S. homeland.
Yeah, I mean, I think the material interests are real. I mean, people always complain about no blood for oil. I can't imagine too many things that are more worth fighting over than oil. I mean, oil is cheap energy. It's a better life for the American people and our allies. It's an international market, so that's huge, and that's in addition to the ties of affection that we have with countries like Israel. So I mean, that's enough. But I think there's also a security issue which is tied to the oil issue, which is that Iran is seeking something like hegemony, or at least the ability to use the resources of the region to expand its ambitions, and that would endanger us, and it would endanger the international system that we enjoy and profit from, and gives our lives more comfort and security. So I think there are plenty of material interests in the Middle East.
If I may, in this brief response, Bridge, you have, I think, articulated why the progressive realist alliance tried by people like Steve Clemens in the last decade was destined to fail.
Yeah, no, I agree.
Anyway. Okay, all right. And here's another question from the audience, I'm guessing from Noah Pollack. Can Israel trust Obama on Iran?
Maybe I'll go first on that.
Why hasn't anyone tried diplomatic engagement?
No, I think, and we've kind of danced around the issue of timing and when this real discussion will need to take place. But I think we've seen this play out in recent days. I mean, the Israelis are looking at the situation and looking at their own military capabilities and realizing that if they were to take action, they're probably going to need to do so fairly soon, whereas the Obama administration, looking at the U.S. military capabilities and looking at the intelligence, believe they have more time. And I think a lot of us read Prime Minister Netanyahu's speech on Monday night at AIPAC, and you understand it from would any American president ever say, or to his people, that I trust this other country to defend our interests if it comes to it? That would be unacceptable here, and American voters rightfully would vote that person out of office and laugh them out of office. And that's the situation Prime Minister Netanyahu is in right now. If Israel loses the ability to act against Iran's program, they are reliant upon either President Obama after he's reelected, or on a new president who we haven't even seen in the Oval Office yet. And so I think I have a lot of understanding, I think, of where the Israelis are coming from. And I would hope that would focus President Obama's thinking, because I do think it would be better if the United States would take action rather than Israel. And I do think it's better if we think the Israelis are going to take action, that we do so instead, or we at least make a commitment to stand by them and back them up in terms of the Iranian response.
The personal relationship about Obama, I don't know, I can't really comment on, but I think Israel can trust the United States, and that's something that Israel can definitely do. And I disagree with Jamie, and I think it gets back to an earlier point that I think it's important to address about how fragile our extended deterrence and our alliance commitments are. I mean, there are people in this audience who live in countries, or are representative of countries, that absolutely do trust the United States, and have trusted the United States really since the Second World War to defend them, obviously in cooperation, but without the United States it would not have, the system would not have worked. And in the case of Saudi Arabia, the United States has defended Saudi Arabia, not as if it's, who knows, as if it's a part of the United States, but it's come to Saudi Arabia's defense repeatedly. And of course, we don't need to have a security treaty to do so. In fact, our defense of Saudi Arabia may be stronger than it is with countries with which we have more formal relationships. But the proof is frankly in the blood. I don't want to be flip, but that's very real, and the Saudis know that. And I think that is something that, even if the Iranians get the nuclear weapon, and that is the way to avoid the proliferation problem and the instabilities that Jamie aptly describes. We have a very strong interest in both assuring those countries that we will come to their defense, and also that we will take actions that are negative against them if they do pursue in that. And this is something that happened in the 1970s when the U.S. was drawing back from Asia with the Nixon Doctrine, the Guam Doctrine, and Taiwan in particular and South Korea both had abortive efforts towards indigenous nuclear weapons capabilities, but the Americans said, stop what you're doing, or we will have serious problems with these alliances, and they both sort of stopped what they were doing. So I think it can work, yeah, that's the point.
Well, I think, as Jamie rightly pointed out, Israel's facing kind of a now or never situation with its military option for Iran's nuclear program. Its window for effective military action is rapidly closing. So at some point, their non-proliferation policy, if they don't take action now, will be to trust that the United States will take action later if need be. And And so, of course, this is a decision that would be made at the highest levels. So I have no idea what President Obama would do. But I do know the language has gotten somewhat tougher over recent weeks. It used to be the administration would say things like all options are on the table, but the military option is a really bad one and we don't want to go there. Whereas recently they've been much more forceful, saying things like if Iran builds nuclear weapons, they will be stopped. When I say, containment's not an option, I'm not bluffing. So I hope that's the case. I hope that if we get to this point of acquiescing to a nuclear-armed Iran or a strike, that I hope that they mean what they say and that they're willing to do what it takes to prevent it.
This question is for you, Matt. Can you address the issue of intent of the Iranian regime and the fact that nuclear knowledge will still exist even after the facilities are destroyed?
Well, we think that Iran's two primary strategic goals are to continue to exist as a state and to become the most dominant state in the Middle East. And so nuclear weapons give Iran both of those things. They give it kind of the ultimate security guarantee, and they give it a cover under which to be more aggressive in the region. So nuclear weapons are seen as very valuable in Tehran. That's part of the reason that I'm skeptical that we can get a diplomatic solution. The Supreme Leader isn't aiming for an arms control agreement with the United States. That doesn't serve his interest. Nuclear weapons do. This question of whether we can, it really gets back to Bridges' point that he raises in the article on today, is a strike a permanent solution, or does it just kick the can down the road, and is Iran going to reconstitute, and we're going to be back at this decision point a few years from now? And so I think that is a danger, but I think that there's also reason to think that a strike could bring significant benefits. So the first is, it's possible that Iran could give up after a strike. So Bridge and many others assume that Iran would double down and reconstitute its nuclear program quickly, and that's possible, but it's also possible that they would say, look, we're going to spend another decade rebuilding these nuclear facilities. It's going to be incredibly expensive, and we're just going to open ourselves up to attack again. It's not worth it. And there is a historical precedent. Syria had a nuclear reactor bombed in 2007 by the Israelis. As far as we can tell, Syria has not restarted its nuclear program. So it's possible Iran would give up. Second, I would say that buying time is valuable in and of itself. So Bridge said that a U.S. strike would only buy 1 or 2 years. It's impossible to know because it depends on projections about things that we simply can't know in advance, like does Iran decide to reconstitute its program? How quickly does it decide to reconstitute? Is it able to get supplies on the international market that it still needs? What kind of post-strike containment regime has the United States put in place? So all these estimates about how much time it buys are guesses. But the 1 to 2 estimate is for an Israeli strike, and people often confuse those. The United States has much greater capabilities. We'd buy much more time. Again, it's impossible to know. My best estimate for a U.S. strike is somewhere between 3 and 10 years. So it's more than what an Israeli strike would buy. Eli's asking me to wrap it up.
No. I was just. Oh. Go on.
Okay. So time is valuable in and of itself. If we have to face a nuclear-armed Iran, I think we'd all rather face it in 10 years rather than starting next year. And the hope with the strike is that something happens with that time to where Iran ends up permanently without nuclear weapons. Maybe there's an indigenous regime change, maybe there's some kind of further conflict, buys space for further diplomacy. So it buys time for something to happen. And I think it also shifts the bargaining space. I think there's reasons to believe that a strike would make diplomacy harder, but I think there's also reasons to think it could make it easier. As I said before, the Supreme Leader is in no mood to negotiate now. He's months away from a coveted nuclear weapon. But I think he would be much more willing to trade away a shattered nuclear program, to trade away some rubble, rather than a coveted nuclear program that's so close to delivering a nuclear weapon. So in short, I think that there's no guarantee that a strike permanently prevents Iran from acquiring nuclear weapons. But if we stand by while Iran builds nuclear weapons, we're guaranteed that they get nuclear weapons. So that's the choice.
Okay, this next question I think might be a trick question, but I'm going to ask it anyway. We talk only about a U.S. or Israeli-led attack. What about the chances of a military cooperation from our European allies or even our Arab allies, like Saudi Arabia and the UAE, in an attack? What are the chances of that? A big NATO effort?
My guess is that I would not be surprised if it comes to it, that you would have the United Kingdom and maybe even France, if we wait until after the presidential election.
Getting together in
Sarkozy
Brussels,
is
voting.
reelected. I would think there would would not just be the U.S. by itself. There would be other countries involved. I would doubt that most of our Arab allies would participate in a formal manner, but we have obviously provided them with capabilities to help in terms of an Iranian response. I just want to pick up on the last question because it goes back to, I think, the first question on the question about why can't we pursue covert efforts further. I think Syria is an interesting case. Let's see, once the Assad regime falls, maybe we'll know the real truth about the nuclear program. It'll also be interesting to see how many Syrian scientists were actually involved in that program. My guess is it was a handful, because it was obviously done with North Korean cooperation. In the case of Iran, people just need to understand this is a vast program. It's been operating for years. I think they have 9,000 plus centrifuges running right now at 2 different facilities. They've got centrifuges being produced at other facilities that the IAEA has rarely visited. And centrifuges, and even in small numbers that you can use to enrich and produce HEU, you can set them up anywhere. I am not convinced, I guess unlike many in the intelligence community, that, or some of the responses like Colin Call's response to Matt's piece, that, well, we doubt they have covert sites, or we'd probably find out about them if they tried. We certainly did in the case of Qom, this site that President Obama and some of his counterparts revealed in late 2009. But my guess is the Iranians would be completely stupid if they hadn't also set up a few other sites to maintain the capabilities. And people just need to understand as well, once you master centrifuge technology, that's a knowledge. You can't bomb that out of existence. This will remain. There are probably hundreds, if not thousands, of scientists who have cycled through the program and know how to run centrifuges and can set them up and reconstitute at least that aspect of the program. Weaponization, it's a much smaller group, but again, at this point, that knowledge has proliferated enough in the world that if they forgot what they were doing prior to 2003, they could get that information again. And so it's very difficult to bomb this program out of existence, and that's why I go back to my original argument about the centrality of the regime. As long as this regime is in power, we cannot trust them to give up a desire for nuclear weapons. And I think that Syria is certainly can be seen as a success story right now without knowing additional information, but it's just I have a problem believing that they're comparable.
I'm going to agree with Jamie on 2 points. One is that I agree that the sort of quantity has a quality all its own. In Syria, kind of talking about Syria is a little bit like talking about Grenada versus something like Vietnam, right? There's a difference in scale, and once you get to that scale, it gets to be a much different proposition when you talk about coercing them into doing something that they otherwise wouldn't do. And the Iranians have been pursuing the nuclear weapons program at least for 25 years, and in some respects ever since the Shah, and they've been allocating a lot of resources towards it. We don't really know, as Jamie says, what the Syrians are really up to, but it seems like it was a much smaller scale program. Even with the North Koreans, which is a considerably smaller country than Iran, we are not thinking about launching a preventive major strike on their assets. We know that they've put a lot of effort into it, a lot of resources, and that it would result in high costs. The other thing I agree with Jamie on, and this is something I worked on earlier in my career, is the stark limits of intelligence. And this is part of what goes into my agreeing with the lower, or kind of erring on the lower estimates about the delay we could actually have. If anybody who's ever seen the movie Patriot Games knows that a lot, even terrorist groups are aware of U.S. overhead capabilities, and we haven't necessarily figured a way to look through the earth with too much effectiveness. And so the proliferation of very deeply buried facilities, hardened facilities, these kind of things has been ongoing, and the Iranians are certainly past masters at this. And so we need to take our intelligence assessments with a big grain of salt. I differ with Jamie, I think, a little bit in maybe my subjective judgment, in the sense that I price that into what the intelligence community has to deal with. So I don't fault the intelligence community. It's kind of the tough nut that they're being asked to crack. But I think that we need to be very skeptical about what we can expect from our intelligence capabilities, and that goes directly to the targeting issue, not just for areas that are fixed, but if we wanted to go after their missile programs to blunt retaliatory capability. People remember the first Gulf War, that we had a notable lack of success in hitting mobile scuds and so forth. So I think we need to be very, very conscious of the limits of intelligence and the policy implications thereof.
We're just about getting to the point where we got to do closing statements, but I wanted to This is a good question. From Matt Powers in the audience. How does a nuclear Iran differ from a nuclear Pakistan, especially given Pakistan's historic support for terrorist groups?
I think that if a nuclear-armed Pakistan is a model for what a nuclear-armed Iran looks like, we should all be very concerned. Pakistan has transferred sensitive nuclear material and technology to Iran, Libya, and North Korea. Part of the reasons that Iran and North Korea are so far with the uranium enrichment program is because they got help from Pakistan. There's an academic debate, but some argue that Pakistan's been more aggressive, more willing to attack India since it's had nuclear weapons, in part because it felt like it had this shield under which it could engage in low-level provocation and not suffer serious retaliation. The United States is very worried that nuclear weapons could fall in the hands of terrorist groups in Pakistan, given Pakistan's historic support to terrorist groups. We're very concerned that the Pakistani state might collapse, leading to a loose nuclear weapons problem. Iran is a country with a history of revolutions. Something like that in the future is possible if Iran had nuclear weapons. And Pakistan's only had nuclear weapons for a little over 10 years. They tested in 1998. So we still haven't even seen the full range of consequences of a nuclear armed Pakistan. There could be a nuclear exchange with India and Pakistan, or Pakistan and some other country, at some point in the future. So I think these are all the things that we should be worried about with a nuclear armed Iran. I think that it would transfer nuclear material to other countries. It could potentially be more aggressive, and it could result in nuclear war. So, that doesn't provide comfort.
Jamie Fly.
I completely agree with everything Matt said.
All right. We're almost, I think I got time for one more question, then we're going to go to opening statements, and then I'm going to ask the audience to vote. All right. I like this one. Okay. Is the way to Iran through Syria? If Assad is thrown out with overt U.S. aid, how could that influence Iran?
I'll start off on this, perhaps. I think that's a very good point. I've argued in recent months, and the Foreign Policy Initiative has put out a number of papers on this and organized some open letters to President Obama. We've had a lot of criticisms about President Obama's Iran strategy, and if we're not willing to take a serious approach to Iran right now, I think our best Iran strategy is through Syria. When the Assad regime steps down, and it will only be a matter of time, it's going to be a huge blow to Tehran. They are doing everything they can to bolster Assad via cash transfers, sending in IRGC elements to work with the regime security forces, and that's why the Saudis and Qataris and others in the region are getting involved. And I think it's, well, number one, from a humanitarian standpoint alone, I think it's disgraceful the United States is not willing to do more along the lines of the sorts of policies that Senators McCain, Lieberman, and Graham have advocated in recent days. But just from a strategic standpoint, it's in our interest. And the president even noted this in his interview with Jeff Goldberg again on Friday. He said he understands that Assad being forced out would be a blow to Iran. And so if that's the case, I don't know why the administration is hanging back, waiting for the Russians and Chinese to come around, because it's not going to happen. And so, yeah, I think that the sooner Assad steps down, the better, in terms of fomenting more unrest inside Iran, of perhaps providing a spark to the Iranian opposition. And so I wish we'd be doing a lot more to support the Syrian opposition and bring down Assad as soon as possible.
I'll pass on this one.
All right, well, now we're at the point of closing remarks. I would ask each of our panelists to try to limit it to 3 or 4 minutes. And why don't we go in the reverse order? So why don't we start with you, Jamie, on your case?
Okay, just a few brief points. I mean, we didn't get into negotiations that much, but just the way I see the situation right now is negotiations are unlikely to produce an outcome. We are going to have new talks again in the next couple of months. I don't think the Iranians are going to treat that seriously. And we didn't get into this, but even any negotiated settlement from a nonproliferation standpoint is not going to be ideal and is likely going to leave Iran with some sort of capability that they could reconstitute or use for a covert program if they wanted to violate whatever agreement was decided upon. Sanctions despite the fact that we've now piled on increasingly stronger sanctions, that the Congress has forced the administration to go further than they wanted, that we've got the Europeans and others on board, sanctions have not worked. And that's really the remarkable thing if you you just look at whether the Iranians actually want nuclear weapons. I mean, it's clear they do, because otherwise why would they put their country through what it's going through? Why would they completely destroy their economy if this wasn't an important goal for them? And some of the suggestions about intelligence efforts clearly have not worked either. Despite reports of things like Stuxnet, Iran has expanded its number of centrifuges, expanded the number of enrichment facilities, and is producing more LEU, low-enriched uranium, than ever before. So none of these things are working, and I think that's why you have the Israelis increasingly concerned, and that's why I think we need to start having more of a serious debate about what the next steps are. Especially when you couple that with my comments earlier about the state of our intelligence and about an over-reliance on a supposed analysis that Iran has not made the final decision. I think that's a very dangerous place to be in. I guess I'll just end by returning to my point that our concerns about Iran are much broader than the nuclear program. We have to be concerned about the nature of the regime and what they've done to their own people, but as well as what they've done to our interests in the region, American personnel in the past. And if this really does come down to what someone asked about, kind of Israeli calculations, this is America's responsibility to take the lead. I think it's shameful if we end up outsourcing the Iranian nuclear problem to the state of Israel. It just doesn't make any sense given the interests that we have, both strategically, I think, and morally. And so I guess I just end there. I think Matt should be commended for even making this case, and he's gotten a lot of, I think, hostility in response from some quarters. I do think there are some flaws with his approach, but I'm glad that at least it's sparked off a debate. But I think we need to remember it's not just a narrow issue about the nuclear program. It really comes down to the state of the regime. And as long as this regime, this fundamentalist regime is in power, we cannot, I think, be confident in anything they agree to, anything they commit to, and we're going to continue to have these broader concerns.
Bridge.
Thanks, Eli. I certainly agree with Jamie that the United States should take leadership, but what do we want out of this whole Iran nuclear issue? Well, fundamentally, we want the defense of our interests, which is to say free flow of oil, stability in the region, defense of Israel, and so forth. We want Iran, if possible, we want to avoid the Iranians getting a nuclear weapon, but if they do, we want to avoid their profiting from acquisition of nuclear weapons, and we want an absence of use of nuclear weapons and major war in the region. So how do we get this? What's the best way to get this? Well, we should try to prevent them from getting a nuclear weapon, and we should do a lot. We should not just take diplomatic steps, but we should do whatever kind of covert intelligence stuff is going on and be very forward-leaning. And we may even want to do tailored kinetic kind of stuff where we really, some shells are broken and so forth. But if that fails, what we want to do is we want to make clear to the Iranians that they will not gain from an attempted sort of leverage from their nuclear weapons, and certainly they will not gain from use or transfer of their nuclear weapons, and they will suffer very, very grievously if they do so, far beyond what they would ever conceivably profit. This is sort of kind of the way I envision this in a sense. We will keep them in a headlock until the regime change that Jamie validly points out must happen for them fundamentally to change their perspective on the security situation in the region and the role of nuclear weapons. We will keep them in that headlock until that happens. But we will do so in a way that will keep right on our side, and I think that's something that hasn't come up. I am someone who strongly believes that the United States needs to be willing to use force, and needs to be willing to use force in, frankly, a very terrible way. We need to be frightening to countries like Iran, but we should not unnecessarily go to war if we can avoid it, both for moral reasons and because if we do so in that case, we will have the kind of support domestically and internationally that this kind of effort needs.
Well, I think regardless of who you decide won tonight's debate, that it was a step in the right direction and, I think a success. Because I think a lot of people in Washington have put all of their eggs in the diplomacy and sanctions basket. And this choice between living with a nuclear-armed Iran or a strike is a terrible choice, and people don't want to face up to it, and so they try to avoid it. But I think all of us here address this question head on, and I think that this is the question that, unfortunately, the United States is going to have to face, and we need to have this debate. So Bridges' answer to the what is worse question, a nuclear-armed Iran or a strike, is that a strike is worse and that we should put in place a deterrence and containment regime to deal with a nuclear-armed Iran. But you know, President Bush and President Obama didn't agree on a lot, but they do agree that a nuclear-armed Iran is unacceptable, and I think that they were right. So the question is then how to stop Iran from acquiring nuclear weapons. So Jamie's argument is that as long as the regime's in power, there are going to be serious threats, and we can't stop at just the nuclear facilities. We should have a bigger military option that goes after the regime itself. But I think that our goal should be to eliminate the Iranian nuclear threat, which I do think is the greatest emerging national security challenge to the United States, while avoiding a full-scale war if possible. And I think that the option that I lay out, a surgical strike against the key nuclear facilities, pulling back and trying to de-escalate the crisis, is the only way to do that. So, thank you.
Well, this was a great debate. And obviously, we'll be watching the events. Thank you all very much for coming.